The story of Jesus' encounter with Pilate in John 18. Pilate asks him the most important question he could have ever asked. He said, "What is truth?" and walked away. Imagine that. Imagine that. Standing in front of him who claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. And Jesus had said to him, "They that are on the side of truth, listen to me." And so to you this afternoon, I want to present a message within the time that I have allocated here. And the message is, why do I believe Jesus Christ to be the way, the truth, and the life? I have written a lot on this subject. I've written a book on this called Jesus Among Other Gods. I've written one called Why Jesus. None of that material am I bringing to you here today. I'm just taking some existentially relevant ideas that I hope will form the impetus within your life to carry this message everywhere you go. You see, truth is generally measured, tell us the philosophers, in three ways: logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and experiential relevance. Is what you are saying logically consistent? Is it empirically verifiable? Is it experientially relevant? So there's consistency, verifiability, and relevance. May I just take the third of these on the relevance of the message of Jesus and talk to you a little bit about it. Number one is his description of the human condition. No one describes your heart and my heart more accurately than the person of Jesus Christ. You know, yesterday I was talking to a young woman who comes from a completely different faith, from a different part of this world. And as she was talking to me, she said to me, "I never believed in God because of my faith in the icon that I believed in before." She said, "Now, all of a sudden, in following Jesus Christ,
nevertheless,
I've seen
that's
my heart
it.
in a
That's why
way
people
I have
think, and
never
we are
seen."
grateful that you all do. And that's why here at this conference, I esteem RC as one of the great heroes of the faith today, and the lineup that he's got in here. I wonder why I'm actually here. In fact, I was thinking of the subject they've given me, the existence of God. I wish I could just say, just listen to what the others have said, and that demonstrates it, and we're okay. But it reminds me of the two guys who were sitting for an exam. And at the end of the exam, they were being interviewed for the job, and the man says, "I've got a problem. Both of you guys have answered the questions exactly the same way, word for word. There is no difference in your answers. But I'm going to give it to this gentleman rather than to you." And the guy got offended. "How come if our answers are identical, you're giving it to him and not to me?" He says, "There was one difference. In one of the questions, his answer was, 'I don't know the answer to this question.' And your answer was, 'Neither do I.'" So I just feel like saying, so do I, what you've just heard. I remember when I was at graduate school, sent my doctrinal examination question, and we had these tiny little apartments, and you had to get no help, just your Bible next to you, and it was a multiple page thing, and the opening question was, "God is perfect, explain." So I turned to my wife and said, the only more difficult thing I could think of is define God and give two examples. Now, the fascinating thing about that question is there was just this much of space in which to do the explaining. And I was grateful for that, because the longer the answer, the greater the possibility of heresy on something like that. So I answered in one line. He's the only entity in existence, the reason for whose existence is in himself. All other entities or quantities exist by virtue of something else. And in that sense, he alone is perfect. Uncaused, infinite, undependent. Being in essence. And so when we talk today about a subject as transcendingly intimidating as that, We've got a tough subject on hand. So I'm going to take it in 3 phases. The first I'm going to talk about is the intense philosophical problems that arise from the denial of God's existence. Number 2, how then do we demonstrate God's existence? And number 3, why is the Christian faith unique in representing this particular notion of God and who He is? So that's a tall order within a few minutes on hand, but we will make our attempt to do so. So put your thinking caps on and race along with me. We'll try and do our best. And
John
hopefully
Reed,
the well-known Anglican bishop of years gone by from Sydney, Australia, was on one occasion telling this story. I forget what the context was, but as soon as he finished telling the story, I thought to myself, that is a classic illustration of postmodern thinking. He talked about these 2 Australian sailors who'd just gotten off the boat in England and wandered out into the night to enjoy the nightlife, and they stepped into an English pub, enjoying all the offerings for the night there. They had inebriated quite a bit and stepped out of the pub, wobbling on their feet into a dense London fog. And as they were staggering there outside the pub, they saw a man coming in, unknown to them. He was a highly decorated British naval officer. And so they waited till he came close, and they said to him, "Say, you bloke, do you know where we are?" The English naval officer, rather offended by this, looked at them and said, "Do you men know who I am?" At which point one Aussie said to the other, "We are really in a mess now. We don't know where we are, and he doesn't know who he is." That is the quintessential explanation of what postmodernism is all about. We don't know where we are. We don't know who we are. And yet we are pontificating with rather thick volumes on all of this. Last year I was asked to speak at Johns Hopkins on the theme, what does it mean to be human? Now I like the fact that they wanted it defined, but isn't it fascinating? 2006, we're still trying to figure out who we are. I don't hear of dogs getting together to define dogginess. We're supposed to be at the highest rung of the ladder, and we don't know who we are, and we are doing the defining. If we don't know what it means to be human, what does humanism mean? What was all this writing on humanistic ways of determining ethics and so on? But there's another story I want to link into this. Some years ago, I was speaking at one of the major bar associations of the country, and when I arrived there, I was sitting at the head table, and the woman who was the head of the bar association looked at me and said, "You must be a very bold man." I said, "Why do you say that?" She said, "Because you're dealing with a subject here to an audience who are peddlers with words." I said, "So I'm supposed to be nervous?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Frankly, I wasn't until now." So this was, by the way, in the days when the famous statement was made, "It all depends on what the word is means," made by a rather notable character. And so here they sat with their arms folded. It was lunch hour again, and I was to talk to them about the meaning of words. And I said, before I go into this, let me tell you what the first 3 items on the news were. I said I was watching a television program on the news, and these were the first 3 items. Question number 1 was being raised: do words have any meaning? Or does the speaker reserve the right to fuse his or her words with his or her own meaning? Is there an ontic referent? Is there a point of reference for language? Or does the speaker determine that right to say whatever he or she wants and mean whatever he or she wants? And in our salvation by survey culture, the roving cameraman went around asking the world, do words have any meaning, or do we reserve the right to fuse our words with any meaning we choose to? If the words didn't have any meaning, what does the question actually mean? But they don't ask such questions of themselves. And the survey said, words do not have any meaning. The speaker reserves the right to fuse it with his or her meaning. So that was the first item on the news. I said the second item on the news was, does morality have any absolute? Or does each individual reserve the right to choose his or her own morality? And so the cameraman went around again. Answer, morality doesn't have any absolute. You reserve the right to make your own relativistic choices. I said, first item, do words have any meaning? Answer, no, you reserve the right to fuse it. Does morality have any absolute? No, you reserve the right to be relative at your own whim. I said, do you know what the third item on the news was? We had just sent Saddam Hussein a warning that if he didn't stop playing his word games, we were going to start bombing him. The arms went down. The peddlers with words were willing to listen. You see, we expect of the listener to be held responsible for what he or she has just been told, but we don't give ourselves the same responsibility when we want to flirt with the edges and do whatever it is we want to do. But how did postmodernism come to be? How did these ideas actually gain such popularity and find philosophers to back it? Was it not George Will who said there's nothing so vulgar left in human experience but that we can fly some professor from somewhere to justify it? Postmodernism became like that. But if you go back across the 5 centuries, in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, all the way down to the last century, the 20th century, first it was rationalism's turn. I think, therefore I am. You wanted to hold to your beliefs with indubitable rational certainty. But on the heels of that, the empiricists came along, that the only world you can really speak with certainty is the phenomenal world, but you can empirically verify, and logical positivism was being birthed, and the ideas of reality were then framed in this sort of scientific single vision. So from rationalism, we moved on to empiricism. Empiricism gradually gave way, and in the 1800s, Darwin, with his Origin of Species and so on, began to ground it all within a naturalistic framework. From rationalism to empiricism to naturalism. Existentialism then was birthed in the 1900s, on the heels of the writing of the previous century, just begun by people like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and so on. So existentialism began to hold sway on the minds of young university students, starting from Europe, moving across the waters, and then finding anchor points out here. So you moved all the way from rationalism to empiricism to naturalism to existentialism. Postmodernism was waiting to be born in throwing off the single vision of all of these. It became the kind of an eclectic system. Take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and make yourself the centerpiece of all philosophizing. Now, many times you'll hear authors say something like this: modernity reigned from 1789, the storming of the Bastille in France, to 1989, the fall of the wall in Berlin. Those 200 years are generally given that parenthetical portion of the modern world. But that is done mainly just for some kind of convenience. The fact of the matter is, the writings of Wittgenstein and Saussure and Nietzsche had already paved the way for what postmodernity was going to become. In fact, some of the most vociferous spokespersons for postmodernism, people like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, had already done their US bit of speaking. It was in 1985 that Derrida came to Johns Hopkins and deconstructed the entire United States Constitution in front of that audience to a resounding applause. It was in 1984 that Michel Foucault, who embodied postmodernism, died that horrific death with his body plagued by AIDS and completely destroyed his health. So when we say 1989, we are just using it as a kind of a convenient 200th century mark. The fact of the matter is, the damage in thinking had already been done. In fact, it was in the 1970s that Malcolm Muggeridge said, "It is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself, tired of the struggle to be himself.
He has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, and vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct.